They were called ladies of grace. But behind closed doors, many carried secrets that history refused to touch. Disturbing truths hidden in candlelit rooms, where power, race, and desire twisted into something unspeakable. This is not the story they wrote in history books. This is the story they buried. The story of the women who wore lace and perfume, yet committed acts that would shatter human dignity. They smiled in daylight and prayed in public. But when the doors shut and the night pressed close, some of them became the enforcers of a cruelty history could not name. What happened in those secret rooms when no one dared to speak? In the American South of the 18th and 19th centuries, plantations stood as symbols of wealth and civilization, yet beneath their beauty lay a system of control so absolute that it poisoned every human bond. The air was heavy with cotton dust and silence, the kind of silence that comes from fear. Slavery was not just an institution, it was a world where every relationship, every glance, every breath was shaped by power. Men ruled over women, women ruled over the enslaved, and those at the bottom carried the unbearable weight of both. White women were portrayed as powerless in public life, fragile and pure, the moral foundation of the household. They were expected to obey, to nurture, to embody virtue. Yet within the private world of their homes, many found a different kind of authority. They managed servants, disciplined workers, and supervised every life that moved within their reach. Their command extended over people who could not speak back, and in that imbalance between their own subjugation and their control over others, something monstrous was born. In the parlor, in the bedrooms of great houses, power and fear danced together. The plantation was both an economic engine and a prison of the human spirit. The enslaved were not human beings in the eyes of the law. They were bodies to be bought, used, and punished. For enslaved men, the danger was constant. They were laborers, protectors, scapegoats, and in the darkest corners of that world, targets of something unspoken. The chain of command in white patriarchy was clear. The master ruled, the mistress enforced. Beneath them, the enslaved lived and died under orders that could not be questioned. For many white women, trapped in marriages that denied them affection and power, the people they owned became both instruments and victims of their frustration. They could not defy their husbands, but they could dominate those beneath them. The plantation system gave them the tools to express every repressed emotion in acts of discipline, humiliation, or possession. Society refused to see it. The image of the Southern lady was sacred. To admit that women too could commit acts of coercion would shatter the myth of purity that upheld the entire social order. And so the truth was buried beneath layers of denial. But the evidence has always been there in letters, diaries, and testimonies that whispered of relationships defined not by love, but by control. Some white mistresses turned their gaze toward enslaved men, using them as forbidden outlets for emotion and power. What appeared to be affection was often coercion, masked as attention. These encounters were never equal, never consensual, and never free. To refuse meant punishment, humiliation, or death. To comply meant surrendering dignity and safety. The enslaved man lived within an impossible equation. He was criminalized if he resisted and destroyed if he obeyed. The shame of these moments could never be spoken of. The woman risked her reputation, the man his life. Both were trapped in silence, but only one suffered under its weight. The enslaved were blamed for every rumor, every suspicion, every whisper that slipped through plantation walls. Some were beaten or sold for crimes they did not commit. Others carried the memory in silence, letting it burn through generations like an unhealed wound. Behind the sermons and the Sunday prayers, behind the portraits of smiling women and manicured gardens, lay a culture of denial. The same women who preached morality violated it behind closed doors. They claimed virtue yet enacted domination. They wept for the souls of the enslaved in church while breaking their spirits at home. The hypocrisy was suffocating, and history looked away because the truth was too filthy, too disturbing to fit the polite language of Southern gentility. The system of slavery turned a transaction. Power was the currency, and intimacy itself became a tool of control. The enslaved black man was stripped of choice. His body was a field owned by others. His silence was demanded, his endurance expected. The cruelty was not only physical, it was psychological, spiritual, and generational. Disproportionately, in the rare documents that survive, the language is always coded. A diary might say, "He served faithfully," or "She favored him." But those words often meant something darker. Favor was control. Faithfulness was fear. Each line conceals a history of humiliation the world preferred to forget. What happens when the oppressed become instruments of someone else's pain? The answer lies in the echoes of these hidden lives. The enslaved men who endured such violations were left with no name for their suffering. Society denied their humanity, then denied their pain. Their masculinity was crushed beneath a system designed to weaponize every form of control. Even after freedom came, the silence remained, a silence taught by fear, carried through memory, and buried within families who never spoke of it aloud. The truth began to surface slowly, like a whisper rising from the soil of forgotten graves. Historians studying slave narratives notice fragments, sentences cut short, hints at duties too personal to describe, memories racked in fear. Interviews from the 1930s recorded older men who hesitated before answering certain questions, whose eyes dimmed when recalling their time in the house. They spoke carefully, saying only what they dared. Yet between those silences lay the evidence of coercion, of nights no one dared name. In dusty archives, letters from white women emerged, their handwriting delicate but their words sharp. Some spoke of enslaved men who served with devotion, others of discipline needed when a favorite grew distant. Scholars began to recognize the pattern: affection mixed with punishment, power disguised as attention. What the public once romanticized as loyalty was in truth fear. These fragments were the ghosts of a buried history, the first cracks in a wall of denial built over centuries. When the first researchers published their findings, the world reacted with disbelief. How could the same women celebrated as symbols of purity commit acts of domination? How could victims of patriarchy also become abusers? The question struck a nerve. Some historians dismissed the accounts as exaggerations, unwilling to accept that white womanhood, the pillar of Southern virtue, was stained with such corruption. But others listened. They saw how power does not stop at gender. It finds its way through every gap, infecting those who hold it, no matter how oppressed they seem. For descendants of the enslaved, the revelations reopened wounds that had never healed. Families had always carried whispers, suspicions about why certain ancestors looked the way they did, or why some stories in the family tree began abruptly and ended in silence. The exposure of this hidden history turned those whispers into questions, painful, necessary questions about consent, violence, and survival. To face them meant confronting the unbearable truth that slavery was not only a system of labor, but of psychological warfare that invaded the most private spaces of human life. Museums, documentaries, and artists began to take notice. Exhibits once focused only on cotton and chains started to include the emotional crimes of power, the way domination seeped into love, faith, and motherhood. Plays and poems emerged, giving voice to the men whose suffering had never been recorded. The reaction was divided. Some saw these works as necessary healing, others called them too disturbing, too uncomfortable. But that discomfort was the point. History should never be clean. Modeler scholars reframed these hidden relationships as gendered forms of racial violence. They argued that to understand slavery, we must also understand how its power warped every participant. White mistresses, denied political voice, used control over enslaved people as a substitute for freedom. The enslaved, stripped of all agency, became tools in their captors' struggle for self-worth. This was not affection, it was the rot of a society built on domination. The myth of the Southern lady, gentle, virtuous, morally superior, collapsed under the weight of these truths. What emerged instead was a portrait of moral hypocrisy. The very women who upheld Christian piety and family honor participated in acts that destroyed the humanity of others. This contradiction revealed that slavery was not sustained only by brutality from men, but also by the quiet complicity of women who benefited from it and sometimes took pleasure in its power. As historians uncovered more evidence, public dialogue began to shift. Descendants of enslaved men began to speak, demanding acknowledgement for the pain their ancestors endured. Academic conferences and public panels discussed the emotional complexity of power, gender, and race within slavery. Yet even now, many struggle to accept that women could be perpetrators. The collective memory resists it, clinging to myths of innocence. But the truth does not care for comfort. Theories emerged to explain why such crimes occurred. Power inversion was the first. White mistresses lived under the control of their husbands, yet they ruled over the enslaved. Exploiting black men gave them a forbidden sense of power in a life otherwise dictated by obedience. Another theory pointed to racial fetishization, the way colonial imagination portrayed black bodies as both dangerous and desirable. That twisted fascination allowed desire to disguise domination. And then there was the psychological truth. When a society normalizes ownership of people, it erases the boundary between control and cruelty. In these acts of coercion, intimacy itself became a weapon. Each forced encounter was a performance of dominance, a ritual reminding everyone of their place in a world where whiteness defined humanity. Love, if it existed at all, could not survive such inequality. It decayed into dependence and fear, leaving both sides hollow. When domination becomes the language of love, humanity itself begins to die. Of this hidden history stretches far beyond the plantations. It shapes the way gender, power, and race are still understood today. The silence around black male vulnerability, the shame surrounding discussions of victimhood, the discomfort with confronting female aggression, all of these are echoes of that unspoken past. The trauma lingers not only in bloodlines, but in culture, in the very stories a nation chooses to tell or ignore. These were not personal sins alone. They were crimes of an entire system, acts born from a nation that built its wealth on the ownership of flesh and the silence of truth. The plantations may have crumbled, but the structures of denial remain standing, polished and polite, hiding centuries of cruelty behind the language of heritage and tradition. The time has come to tell what was buried, to give words to the men whose dignity was stolen and to the women whose moral decay was protected by power. Remembering is not about shame. It is about understanding how the abuse of power warps every soul it touches. To study this history is to confront the mirror of humanity itself. The truth is ugly. The truth is uncomfortable. But only when we face it can the descendants of pain and power finally begin to heal. History is not a monument. It is a wound that reopens each time we lie about what happened. In the silence of the fields, beneath the magnolia trees, the echoes of the enslaved still wait, not for vengeance, but for recognition. And in that recognition lies the only kind of freedom worth having, the freedom to know, to speak, and to remember.